that a hierarchy of which activities are of greater weight, the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, Talmud Torah of the individual, Talmud Torah of the Rabbim, and Mikra Megilah, and again, fitting into this larger theme about this tremendous weight that's given to the Megilah. So until now, we've been dealing with it as a text, almost as a biblical text in terms of darshaning psukim, sort of completely glossing over the fact that there's some sense of innovation in it, and there would be an innovation in a change of the look of the letters, but the idea that there's a new holiday and that there's this mitzvah, Mikra Megilah, is seen, in juxtaposition, is seen as absolutely no innovation. And here we're dealing with the weight of the mitzvah of reading the Megilah, that it takes precedence over Talmud Torah and over the Avodah. So now the Gemara continues with that and says the following. Amarava, Pshitali, Avodah. The line starts with the word Avodah. It's about 15 lines down from the top of Gimel Amud Bet. Amarava, Pshitali, it's obviously Avodah Mikra Megilah Adif. If it's between the Avodah and the Beis Hamikdash and reading the Megilah, reading of the Megilah takes precedence. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, like we taught yesterday, that was where the discussion started, right? And he learned it from the Mishpacha, even the Mishpachot Kuhuna and Liviyah. So it shows you the tremendous weight. And also going back to the point that David made yesterday, also the fact that even though this is I think an excellent point, that this is a Golos sort of holiday, and you're back in Eretz Yisrael with the Beis Hamikdash, and maybe you think the whole thing is trivial at this point. Nevertheless, you even are mevatel the avodah, the central sort of religious, activity for the sake of Mikra Megilah. So that we established yesterday. Talmud Torah, Mikra Megilah Adif. And if it's between Torah and Mikra Megilah, and Torah is of course what takes the place of Korbanot, and learning Megillah, then again, Megillah comes first. Samcho shel Beit Rabbi, from the fact that Beit Rabbi established this principle that you're mevatli Talmud Torah, and even though the Gemara yesterday sort of said the Kal V'chomer can only be made in terms of Talmud Torah D'Yachid, in the end the Gemara is not really distinguishing, and it's a little ambiguous. Maybe you even be mevatli Talmud Torah D'Rabbim for Mikra Megilah. So Mikra Megilah takes precedence over everything. Now here's my question though. Talmud Torah meis mitzvah. I'm sorry. No, not my question. Here's another thing that's clear to me. Talmud Torah meis mitzvah adif. Now, so all of these things, Megillah is greater than Torah, and it's greater than Avodah. Another thing that's greater than Torah, meis mitzvah. If you have to involve yourself with the burying of a dead body that nobody else is involved to bury. Midtani, we turn into Breita. Mevatling Talmud Torah lahotzas hamesel lachnasas kala. You negate Talmud Torah, meaning you leave the Beis Medrash in order to accompany out a dead body to be buried, and for bringing in a bride. For things that are done that the larger the participation, the greater the honor that is given, whether it's a case of mourning, whether it's a case of rejoicing. These then you're mevatel Talmud Torah for this sake. Now Tosfos points out, because Hachnasas Kala is not the same as Meis Mitzvah, and this doesn't say you do it for the sake of Meis Mitzvah. So if you take a look at Tosfos says Meis Mitzvah Adif, the little Tosfos here, the first Tosfos Meis, Lav Davka Meis Mitzvah. But because in a minute we're going to be talking about Meis Mitzvah, we say Mitzvah here. But the reality is, now of course, that doesn't mean that every time there's a funeral, everybody leaves the yeshiva. There are, standards. Is it Lefik Vodo or not Lefik Vodo, of the Meis? But if there's a sense that for the burial more people are needed for it to be done in an appropriate way, then that would take, and there aren't other people to do that, then that would take precedence even over Talmud Torah. Okay, so you don't even have to get to the stage of Meis Mitzvah. Certain types of Hotzas HaMeis, you're mevatling Talmud Torah for them. Okay, Avodah Meis Mitzvah. Similarly, if it's between the Avodah and the Beis Hamikdash and Meis Mitzvah, and here we do mean Meis Mitzvah specifically, then Meis Mitzvah Adif. Again, Meis Mitzvah takes precedence. If there's nobody else to bury, then Kohen would leave the Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash to take care of it. How do you know? From the verse it says, Villa Achoso, that it says, and to his sister. This is about the Nazir, but also by a Kohen Gadol, that you're not metame even to immediate family relatives. A normal Kohen is, but a Kohen Gadol is not, and a Nazir is not. And from the fact that the Torah sells all the relatives you're not metame for, even though it already said he's not metame for any relative, we learn an extra thing out of each word. And the Tanya we taught in the Brisa the following. Why is it telling you lachoto? Now Rashi tells you the background. Right? The background is it says al kanafshot meit lo yavo. right, by a nazir. He cannot come into contact with any dead. Or something like that. So and to anybody, he can't come into contact with anybody, and then it spells out father, mother, brother, sister. So why does it have to spell out? It already said not everybody. So basically says no matter what else is, I'm sorry, excuse me, jump there. So it says because the chiddush is, yes, normally you're not matame to anybody, even an immediate relative. But then the fact that it starts spelling it out, like la'aviv, etc., means, okay, you're not matame. Why does it have to say la'aviv if it already said you're not matame to a relative? To tell you that even though you're not matame to a relative, but you would be matame to a mace mitzvah. So in a certain ironic, classic, rabbinic way, since the Torah already said you're not matame to anyone, and then it repeats it again, and not even a father, not even a mother, each repetition is saying, these people you're not matame to, because all they are relatives. But if there's a mace, and presumably, let's say there's another relative available to bury, but if there's a mace around that there's nobody to bury, for that type of a person, you would be matame to. And each one of those words makes it even more extreme. So let's take a look how it's more extreme. So la'achoto, which is the last of those words, right? La'aviv limo lachiv la'achoto, gives you the most extreme case that you would override for the sake of mace mitzvah, because all of those is saying for the relative you're not, but for a mace mitzvah you are, and even if more and more and more extreme, you'll still be matami for mace mitzvah. So what is the example? What does la'achoto teach you? To tell you, we turn in brisa. Why does it say not to your sister? To tell you not to your sister, but yes to a mace mitzvah. Hooray! And here's the example, an extreme example. Somebody's going to shech the korban pesach and to give a bris milah to his son, two big mitzvot that have to be done like now. Certainly, milah you could do it shlo bizmano, but you wouldn't get the mitzvah bizmano. Pesach, if you don't do it, you're not doing it at all. And v'shama shemeis lameis, and you heard that and this person heard that an immediate relative died. Yoho yitama, maybe he should go ahead and involve himself in their burial. No, amarta lo yitama. It says that this nazir cannot come in contact with any dead body. But Yacho kashem sheinu matame lachoto kacheinu matame lameis mitzvah. But maybe the same thing would be true, not just if it's a relative, but even if it's a mace mitzvah. Talmud lomar villa achoto. No, it's only to your sister that this nazir is not matame. Lachoso udeina matame. Avol matame lameis mitzvah. He is matame to a mace mitzvah, and he's matame to a mace mitzvah, even if what he has to give up is the fact that he's not going to be able to bring the korban pesach, he's not going to be able to do a bris milah to his son, and what preceded this was also that the person we might be talking about could be a nazir who's a kohen gadol. Okay, so he has all of these other statuses that he would have to override for the sake of mace mitzvah and negate all these other mitzvahs, and nevertheless mace mitzvah override. So this is very powerful in some extreme statements that the Gemara makes about what has to take precedence if there's a dead body and it's not being given treated in the respect that, or just taken care of the way it needs to, how much that overrides in terms of the kedusha that it overrides, in terms of the other mitzvot that it overrides. So back to our point, the Gemara is saying, it's clear to me, therefore, that mace mitzvah trumps avoda, because this person is not bringing the korban pesach. And he's also kohen gadol. Anyway, so, no, 1 minute. So, so that all that is clear to me. So what do I know? I know that... okay, so this was already just out. Okay, so I know that Megilah is greater than Avoda, and I know that Megilah is greater than Avoda, and it's greater than Talmud Torah, and I know that Mace Mitzvah is greater than Avoda and greater than Talmud Torah, right? So what's the one thing I don't know?
Mitzvah and Megilah.
Right, the relationship between Mace Mitzvah and Megilah. So, Rava asks, Mikra Megilah Mace Mitzvah, Hai Minayu Adif. But let's say it's between Mikra Megilah and Mace Mitzvah. Which one is more important? Now, given all the tremendous weight we've given to Mace Mitzvah, it would be hard to understand how you could give more importance to Megilah. But now we're going to finally articulate where some of the weight of Megilah comes from. So, Mikra Megilah Adif Mishum Pirsumei Misa. It's publicizing the miracle, and this is an important point, about what we're going to sort of be seeing about the idea of it's not just an idea like certain things are Dvarim Shepikdusha and you need a minion. Here, the idea is you want everybody sort of actively participating in it because of the idea of to publicize the miracle, and that might therefore, since it's introduced here, but that might explain some of what we saw yesterday. say, I don't care. Leave the Beis Medrash, leave the Beis HaMikdash. Don't say you'll read the Megillah on your own at a later time. It's important that everybody comes together, even if it means overriding Avodah, overriding Talmud Torah. So the idea of Pirsumei Nisa is not just the doing of the mitzvah, but the bringing everybody together, and that could explain some of the overrides before. So maybe therefore it also overrides the Meis Mitzvah. Odiama Meis Mitzvah Adif, Mishum Kvod HaBriot. Right? And here the Gemara articulates the theme of Meis Mitzvah, the honor due to God's creatures, to human beings, even in their death. And that fundamental thing of letting a body just sort of, there, that nobody's caring for, and it's bizayon, and it's, in disrespect and in disregard, that would be a huge problem. So which one takes precedence? So Basar Debaya Hadar Pashte, after he asked it, he finally came to the conclusion, Meis Mitzvah Adif. The Amar Mar, Golo Kavod Brios Shedocha Lo Tasa B'Torah. The principle of Kavod Brios is greater. How do I know the principle of Kavod Brios is greater? Because it even overrides a negative prohibition in the Torah. Until now, we've been talking about which has precedence for certain positive mitzvot, but not overriding negative. Now, this is based on a Gemara in Brachos, and the idea of overriding a negative is, is qualified there. It starts by the idea that the Gemara learns that you don't, somebody who would not be, according to their honor, to bend down and pick up a lost object and return it. They wouldn't even do it for their own object there, like a sage or very elderly person. It would be considered beneath their dignity. So that person doesn't do it. So he's not only is he mevatel the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, but he's mevatel the negative mitzvah of lo tuchal lihitalem, ignoring the Aveda. But the Gemara obviously limits that and mostly says that it overrides to Rabbanans. It's a very limited example of where it would override the Oraitas. But nevertheless, what is very significant is, that I think the counterweight, which unfortunately most people think, which is that religious activities are the more like ritual ones and the ones that have to do with God, whereas the ones that have to do with human beings, that's just like ethics or morality. Obviously, like religious activities take precedence. So you can be like mean to somebody or cheat them if you're going to use the money for covered Shabbos or something like that. So here, the Gemara is in the end, all of these various activities give way to a mitzvah, which is fundamentally based on an issue of kavod habriot, and even somebody who is dead, the idea of kavod habriot really trumps all of these. Yes, Michael.
So if we just read a moment ago, Talmud Torah Otzata Mates, which we can Hasat Kala.
Yeah.
Right, and what about that? That Shabbat, Elovim Shalom Kapotim Talmud Torah Kanei Kulam, and in that list was Le'ata Mate and Masat Kala.
Yeah, so that's talking about the schar of the mitzvah, not about this momentary decision about what you have to do.
So it's interesting then. So
it's
even though the schar is greater than Talmud Torah, nevertheless, in this instance, you're
exactly. For this moment, it's not like you're never going to learn Torah again in your life. For this moment, you have to address the immediate issue. The bigger chiddush is the avodah, because does it really mean the avodah won't get done? Or does it mean it's being delayed, right? Talmud Torah in the end is something that you're not doing now, but it's not like you lose an opportunity to do later, which is important in general of questions about what is doche, an osek mitzvah, pater mina mitzvah, and often Talmud Torah gives because it could be done later. So, all right. And there's other reasons also why Talmud Torah might give way to other mitzvot. Okay, so the Gemara says like this, but that's a good point. That normally we say Talmud Torah Kanei Kulam, but the weight of it doesn't necessarily determine this issue of which takes precedence. Okay, so the Gemara says like this, Gufa. All right, so that was the end of that earlier discussion of like various hierarchies, and we've introduced the principle of Pirsumei Nes, which again would sort of make the demand here, the specific demand, I don't care what you're doing, everybody gets together to read the Megilah. We'll see Pirsumei Nisa come up in other forms as well as we continue today. Gufa. I'm Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Now back to specific issues about Mikra Megilah. Says Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Krach v'kol ha-samach lo v'kol ha-nira imo nidon kikrach. So the krach, the walled city, and any place near it and visible to it has the same status as the walled city, and reads on the 15th. Tana, we turn to Brisa. Samuch afapi sheno nira. Nira afapi sheno samuch. It's one or the other. If you're close, even if you're not visible, or if you're visible, even if you're not close. Bishlema nira afapi sheno samuch. I can understand an example of being visible without being too close. Mishkachas lo yasuf rosh hahar. So if it's the city's at the top of the mountain, so you could have a village that's very far away, but you got a very good, what?
A good line of sight.
A good line of sight, and you could see villages that are far away. So that would also be considered to be part of the krach. That'd be fascinating. Like, how far would that go? How many miles would that go? Okay, Ella, how do you have something that's nearby? And remember, yesterday we said nearby was within a meal, within a kilometer. So how do you have something that's within a kilometer that's not sort of visible? So, what?
There's a lot of trees in your way.
Well, right. So the Gemara says, "I'm Rabbi Yomi Yosheves Benachal." It's the reverse of in the city. The village is high. The city is in a wadi, and the village is, let's say, on the level ground. So you can't see from the city up to what's on the level ground, even though it is not so distant. Okay. Yeah.
Near emo doesn't seem to mean one is visible from the other. It's that they're both visible from a certain point, from another point.
But what is that other point, though?
Well, it depends. Let's say you have, a mountain in between, right? So I can't see from here to here, but from here I can see both.
But how do you understand then the answer of Yosheves Baha? I understand, you're right. Nira emo means like from a third perspective, from an outside perspective, it's visible together. But then what does it matter whether one's in a valley or one's in a wadi or one's on a mountain? Right?
I can imagine.
No, but I think the fact that the Gemara is saying that if it's on a mountain and this is somewhere here, that's considered near emo, even though it's very distant, right? The logical answer is that we're looking from the perspective of the city. If we're looking from a third perspective, right, how does being on the mountain make these two more visible together? Right? If anything, they're more visible together if they're on the same plane. I agree with you, the language is from an outside perspective, but the answer seems to be, assume it's from the perspective of the city. Okay, so the Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Now, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi also says, going back to this definition of the city, I'm sorry, I'm talking to myself now. Oh, okay, I was wondering who's making that noise. Of course, it's me. Okay, V'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Krach yashav u'besofu kaf nidon kikfar. Now, this, if you have a krach, for now we'll read it, a walled city that was settled, and then it was the wall was built. So first people started living in it, and then you built the wall afterwards. That's just like a village. That doesn't count as a walled city. It's my time, which means now you not only have to know that it was walled from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, but you have to know that first the wall was built, and then it was inhabited. Because the verse says by selling houses in walled cities and the special halachot that apply to them as far as the Yovel is concerned, the Ishkim Kor Beis Moshav Ir Choma. If a person sells a house of settlement in a walled city, so that means it's a Beis Moshav that was in an Ir Choma, that the Ir Choma preceded the fact that it was a Beit Moshav. So the Gemara is assuming, so let's assume whatever, so that's the read of that verse. But taking that for the read of the verse, what's interesting is the Gemara is taking a halacha about selling houses in walled cities and applying it to the issue of Megilah. Right? What does it have to do? Maybe there's certain halacha for houses in walled cities and for laws of yoga. What does it have to do with this halacha about reading within a walled city or not walled city and what the definition is? And because of this question, right, Rashi sort of reads the statement that he's saying. Rashi says we're not actually talking here now about halachas of Megilah. We're talking about halachas about when he says the question about was this wall built first or whatever. The halacha is about just this halacha about selling houses in a walled city. We're not talking about hilchos Megilah.
Meaning to be either walled or settled first.
Yeah, this issue of walled settled first is just about halachas, not about hilchos Megilah.
No, for Megilah purposes, it could be, doesn't make difference on the wall.
Right, for Megilah it wouldn't matter. For Megilah it wouldn't matter. That's what Rashi says. But it doesn't fit in the flow of the Gemara, and Tosfos disagrees. And what it really seems that we're dealing with here, and this is important because it gets us to the question of the significance of Yemos Yoshua ben Nun, which seems to be arbitrary, is that what Chazal sometimes do is that they take pre-existing categories, definitions, which is convenient, and apply them to new halachot, even if they don't exactly match, those new halachot. But it's easier to reuse a category. So, for example, at the beginning of Gittin, you have the idea if somebody brings a get from Chutz La'aretz Eretz Yisrael, he has to say B'fanei Nechtam, B'fanei Nechtam. He has to testify to ways it was written because they don't necessarily know how to do the halachas correctly outside of Eretz Yisrael. And then the Gemara discusses, well, what are the parameters of Eretz Yisrael? And it then discusses the parameters of Eretz Yisrael for like Hilchos Trumas and Maasros of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. What the heck does that have to do with the areas that know how to write a get correctly or not? And the answer is it doesn't necessarily. But if there's this halacha that deals with Eretz Yisrael, whatever the reasons are, it might be more convenient to just use a pre-existing definition of Eretz Yisrael and apply it here. And that seems to be a little bit of what's going on. We have a definition in other halachot of walled cities. Let's borrow that category and use that category here for defining what constitutes a walled city. And that seems to be what the Gemara is doing, taking something from Bati Erechom and applying it here. And that also therefore explains the significance of Mukaf Choma Mimos Yoshua bin Nun, because that actually is a halacha that is relevant in other areas. Number one, for example, this thing like walled cities, but beyond this issue of like houses in walled cities, if it goes by the first time that had that status, it was when they came in at the time of Yoshua bin Nun, and maybe the Kedusha Rishonas, Kid Shalasid Lavo, etc. So that status that when they went in Yoshua bin Nun would still be relevant even by Bayit Sheni. But another reason that it's important is, and this is a very little known fact, is that if you look in the beginning Mishnayot in Kalim, you see that when it lists the different levels of Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, it starts with the Beis HaMikdash, then Har Bayis, then Yerushalayim, and between Yerushalayim and all the rest of Eretz Yisrael, you know what comes as a middle status? Guess. Walled cities from the time of Yoshua bin Nun. So, and their status is something that basically, like the thing that they're considered Machane Yisrael. The same way the Torah says you send out of the Machane, the Mitzoraim, you send them not only outside of Yerushalayim, but you send them outside of the walled cities. So a walled city, as a city, not just a house in a walled city has a halacha, but the whole status of the identity of the city as some special status is a pre-existing halacha that applies to walled cities from the time of Yehoshua bin Nun. So I actually think that is what is going on about this arbitrary assignment of Yemos Yoshua bin Nun as opposed to Yemos Achashverosh. I'll say other reasons later, but I think that's really what we see in these next couple of halachot, the drawing on other categories to apply to the definition of walled city here by Megilah. Yes, David.
So maybe another time you can help us understand why walled cities should have a special status.
Right.
Especially starting in the Chumash, cities have really bad press. Cities are places of corruption.
That's a fascinating point. It's a very interesting point. I assumed it was because walled cities has well-defined demarcations and sort of like the idea of a Machane Yisrael and a mini Machane when you transfer that idea to Eretz Yisrael. As opposed to villages, there's no like demarcating lines. But that's a very interesting insight. All right, so for some other time. All right, so the Gemara says like this. Okay, so where are we? Okay. Okay. First it was in Ir Chama, and then it was settled. And that's by houses in walled cities, and therefore, presumably, according to Tosfos at least, that's the same by Megilah.
So they actually knew which ones?
Yeah, so that's always the question. How do you know, and what do you do if you don't know? Now, if a krach, again, we'll say it means a walled city, doesn't have 10 batlanim, 10 people that are just sitting around and doing nothing, so the idea of like somebody as a minion man and available for making a minion, this was an idea already in the Gemara, people that would basically be present to, in some communal capacity and always available. That's called the asara batlanim. So Nido Kikfar, if it doesn't have those people, then it's not big enough to be considered a krach, and it's only a village. Now, presumably this means even if it is a wall from the time of Yoshua bin Nun, which is a fascinating new criteria. So the Gemara says, "My kamashbalam." Where do you learn this? The Tanina, we taught it. What is this teaching us? We've already taught, which is coming up later in the Mishnah. Either Yer Gedolah, what's considered a big city, Kol sheyeshbo asara batlanim. If it has 10 batlanim, it's a Mishnah coming up. Pachos mikana reis kfar. Less than that, it's a village. So the Gemara says, no. Krach itzrichle. No, you need to tell me that it's true, even in the case not just of a big city, but of a krach, like of a metropolis or of a walled city. Because what would I say? I would say, well, if you got like a big town, an Ir more often is a town than a city, right? A kfar is a village, an Ir is a town, and a krach is a city. Okay, so if you have a city, so a city has a lot of people coming in from outside. Although you have an enormous amount of foot traffic and people are coming from outside, and you might think that you don't need Atzar Batlani because you'll never have a problem, making a minyan, or you'll never have a problem of getting enough people because there's so much, there's so much ingress that maybe you don't need Atzar Batlani, and it always has an important status. It says no, even that you need Atzar Batlani. Now the question here is, what do you need the Asar Batlanim for? When the Mishnah later says to be an Ir Gedolah, it needs Asar Batlanim, or if not, it's a Kfar. What's the significance of being an Ir Gedolah? Do you remember what we taught in the first Mishnah, as opposed to a Kfar, as opposed to a village? right?
Which day?
What happens? The arim, what?
They're not self-sufficient.
Yes, but what's the halachic difference, right? What does the Mishnah say? There's three things in the Mishnah. There's hukaf choma, right? And there is kfarim, and there's ayarot gedolot, right? So a kfar reads when?
When they market day.
Market day. Ayarot gedolot always read on the right day, unless there's a Shabbos problem. So what this Mishnah later is saying is, to determine, are you a village or an Ir Gadol, will you be pushed back to a market day, or do you read on the right day? If you don't have a Sar Batlanim, then you're not a big enough, town to be an Ir Gadol. You are just a kfar, and you're going to get pushed back. That's what it says. So the question is the Gemara now saying that also is what required, even if you have a wall from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, you need a Sar Batlanim. So Tosfos says, no, that's going too far. Because you got a wall from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, that's enough to give it significance, and the Gemara would have mentioned that explicitly. And Tosfos wants to say that what this means is, even if you have a walled city, not has a wall from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. You have a metropolis, you have a large city, it's got a wall, just not Yoshua ben Nun. And still the question for Tosfos is not whether you're a 15 or a 14, whether you're a walled city that reads on the 15th or not that reads on the 14th. He says the issue, even by the walled city here, is not a wall from Yoshua. And the question is, even with that wall, you're not necessarily significant enough to read on the 14th if you don't have a Sarah. Okay, so this is a little bit confusing because it uses the word krach, and until now krach has been the question of the status of a walled city to read on the 15th, which is a way to read this Gemara. It's probably the pshat way to read this Gemara, that it's not enough that it has a wall, it also needs a Sar Batlanim, the same way an ear needs a Sar Batlanim, a krach needs a Sar Batlanim, but Tosfos does not want to read it that way. Tosfos wants to say we're dealing with a wall not from Yehoshua, and still the issue is whether it has the status as an ear or not. Yes.
I was looking at it seemed like the real matter was, if you're not big enough, you're not going to have someone able to read the Megillah. So you got to go.
I know, but again,
it's so big. I mean,
well, that's what the Gemara says. That's the chiddush. That's the Kamashmalah.
But forget about that.
I don't want to belabor. We got to move on. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Krach charav u'blosof yashav nidon ki krach. If a krach was destroyed and then resettled, it has the status of a krach. So the Gemara says, "My charav." What it means it was destroyed. That the walls were knocked down, people were still living there, the walls were knocked down, and then they were rebuilt. So Yashav in lo, Yashav lo, so it only has its status if the walls are rebuilt. The Hatani, we taught in the Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yossi Omer, Asher lo choma, that it has a wall. This is again selling houses in places with a walled city. So there's a little question here, the way it's read or written. Is it read lo, that with a vav, that it has a wall, or lo choma, that it doesn't have a wall? So he says you read it both ways. Even if there's no wall now, as long as it initially had a wall, it's considered to be a house in a walled city. So again, notice, because for the laws of houses in a walled city, it's enough that once it had a wall, even though it doesn't have a wall now, the same will be true by walled cities for Megilah. So why would you say that the wall was knocked down and rebuilt, even if it wasn't rebuilt? If it once had that wall, that would be enough. Again, borrowing a category from houses in the walled city for the laws of like Yovel and applying it to Megilah. You don't need it to have a walled city now, which by the way is important, right? Because then it means that on the one hand, we can't assume that anything that's a walled city now reads on the 15th, because the question is, was it from the time of Yoshua ben Nun? But we also can't assume that anything that's not a walled city now doesn't read on the 15th, because it might have had a wall that was knocked down, right? And they're definitely ancient cities, right, that had walls and they were knocked down, and they might read on the 15th. Okay, so again, borrowing from the laws of Batei Arechoma, we say it doesn't need the wall to be rebuilt. So what would need to be rebuilt for it to regain the status? So Ela my charav shecharav me'asar batlanim. Back to this idea. It had 10 batlanim, then it stopped, so it loses its status, whether it's status of a 15 or status of a 14. That's the issue I mentioned before. When it regains the asar batlanim, it'll regain the status. Okay, so what have we introduced? We've introduced the idea that for two things from Batei Arechoma. Number one is it has to first have made the wall and then be settled. Number two, it doesn't need the wall right now. And it seems that the Gemara is saying we're just going to borrow those definitions from Batei Arechoma and apply them to the halacha of reading on the 15th. And I included in that the idea of borrowing, where I think is why we get the basic idea of walled from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. The other issue, a criteria we introduced is Asar Batlanim, which might be a criteria to read on the 15th, might be only a criteria to read on the 14th. Okay, now the Gemara goes on. If I'm a Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, now we're going to start a lot of statements of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi all around Megilah, and now we're going to start listing, talking about specific cities. Lod, Va'ono, Vigei, HaCharashim, these three cities, Mukafot Chomom, Yemos Yoshua ben Nun Havu. These were all cities mentioned in the Psukim by Shevet Binyamin, and he had a tradition that all of these were walls from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. So the Gemara says, "V'hani Yoshua baninu." 1 minute. Yoshua built those walls. Va'alfa'el baninu. Alfa'el built them. Dichsiv u'bnei Alfa'el Ever Misham v'Shamar Hu bana et Ono vet Lod u'bnotel. He, or Alfa'el or Alfa'el's children built Ono and Lod. So two of the three cities. What?
And he's a lot later than Yoshua.
Yes, and he's a lot later than Yoshua. This was in the time of the Pilegesh Begiva. Okay, so the Gemara says so at least two of them were built later than Yoshua. So the Gemara says, 1 minute. According to that, you're saying, oh look, Alfa'el built it. I'll tell you a third person built it. Asa baninu, Asa built it. Tichsiv, it says, Vayiven, and Argyr says Asa, but that is not in the verse. The verse is if you look at the side. Vayiven Arei Mitsuda, Mitzora, is it Mitsoda? Mitsuda? No. Mitzorah, yeah, I think like Bitsuro, Mitzorah Yehuda. Anyway, but the Gemara is stuck in the word Asa because that is the clear actor in the verse, even though it's not in the verse itself. So anyway, so he built them. Now exactly how we know that it's talking about what do you call it? About these cities. Rashi says that it's clear from the context that these are cities that are in Binyamin, although it says Arei Yehuda, and it's assuming if they're in Binyamin, it includes all of these cities. Okay, again, though it's not as specific as the previous verse, but anyway, that's the Gemara's question. If he built up the walls of all of these cities in Yehuda and Binyamin, then he built them. So it's not Alfa'el. So the Gemara says I'm a Rebbe Linzer. So Rebbe Linzer says not all true. They really were had a wall in the time of Yoshua ben Nun. The time of Pilegesh Begiva, where they, basically decimated Binyamin and destroyed all the cities. So the walls were knocked down in the time of Pilegesh Begiva. And then Alfa'el came and rebuilt those walls that were destroyed in the time of Pilegesh Begiva. Harder info, then they started crumbling. They weren't completely destroyed, but they started, over time crumbling. And Asa Shaftzino, and Asa came and he sort of fixed them up. He improved them. Okay, so all three are true. Diganami Dechsiv, it also works what the verse says. Vayomer lihuda nivne et harim ha'elu. So Asa said to Yehuda, let us build up these cities. Michlal da'arim havu beikar, they were already cities. And he was just putting up the walls. That doesn't mean they might have been cities without any walls, but anyway, the Gemara is saying they're important cities. They already had some wall. He was just improving it. Okay, Shma Mina. Again, what's not answered is, what do you do if you don't have a tradition? What do you do if it has a wall? You don't know if it's time of Yoshua ben Nun. You know it's from the time of Yoshua ben Nun, but you don't know you don't know if it was first the wall was made and then it was settled, and then the wall was made, right? How do you deal with these areas of doubt? Do you sort of assume that everything is on the 14th unless you can prove otherwise? Or do you assume that no, once there's a certain doubt raised, then you have to read both on the 14th and the 15th, right? So these are very important halachic questions. The other important halachic question, which I mentioned yesterday, ties into the issue of Nira and Samuch, is let's say you have a continuous buildup of a city like Yerushalayim, right? I mean, how much of Yerushalayim is the walled city of Yerushalayim, but not all of it is Samuch and Nira to the walled city, right? But if it's a continuous buildup, then does it just continue to get that halacha as well? So a lot of these are very relevant questions. Yes?
So it sounds like we have three different categories that are going on.
Yeah.
One is architecture.
Right.
One is sociology. And one is historical status.
You mean by sociology? You mean like the Asar Batlanim, or?
Well, it could be Asar, yes, but the way that a walled city operates has to be different because people actually build their homes in the wall.
Right.
So the responsibility of people to the policy was different in a walled city than other places. But the question really that calls out here consistently is like, what are they trying to get at?
Right. So the Gemara will get to that a little bit later we'll see when it deals with some questions of exactly what constitutes a wall. So let's hold off on that. Okay. Right now what I'm seeing is a formalistic borrowing from other categories, but there could be questions about what actually are the sort of issues that are at stake here as well, and that we'll see as we continue. Okay. So not today, but in a soon. Okay. So the Gemara says like this. V'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Again, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, very famous statement that appears in a couple of contexts. Nashim chayavos b'mikra Megillah. Nashim are obligated in the reading of the Megillah. She'avhin hayu ba'oto hanes. That even they were in that miracle. Although it's a time-bound mitzvah, and you would say normally women would be exempt, here they're obligated because even they were in the miracle. Now, there's two questions about this. Well, actually, there's three. One specific to Megillah, but in general about this statement. Number one is what the phrase of Afhin Hayu Ba'oto Hanes means. Does it mean that they were saved by the miracle, which is, they would have been wiped out by Purim? This is also used by Hanukkah to say that if Hanukkah, women are obligated Afhin Hayu Ba'oto Hanes because similarly they were under the same edict at the time of Hanukkah, and it's used by, the other thing it's used by though is the Arba Kosot. So, and they were saved by the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So women were always sort of in the category of those that were part of the miracle, included in the miracle. Of course, if you raise that, then it's true about everything. It's true about Sukkah. It's true about, why don't they have to take Sin of Sukkah? Why don't they have to take Lulav, right? So what's specific about that? That it's dafka the three applications that exist in the Gemara, which is Hanukkah, Purim, and the Arba Kosot. I'm going to come back to that, but I will tell you there's an alternate read of this, which is the Rashbam, which doesn't just mean that they were included in those that were saved by the miracle, but that they were centrally instrumental in the miracle, because it says, and now this isn't, so if you take a look like Tosos has it, where, let me just read Tosos, to Avin Hayuboso Anes, he says, Pirish Rashbam, She'ikar Anes Hayayadan, but Purim Yidei Esther, so that's an easy one. But Chanukah Yidei Yehudit, the story about, Yehudit and who fed the whatever, sort of like a Yael story there. And the Pesach, Shebiskush Nashim Tzidkaniyos Sheba'osa Dor Nigalu, right? The famous Gemara that it was because of the righteous women. The kosher, the Lashon She'afhein, Masha saying Tfeilot. It sounds like they were like secondary, not primary. Now, you could say it means that they were also instrumental. Being instrumental is not necessarily the same as being primarily, but okay. But if the way the Rashbam wanted to read it, which is that they were like the primary sort of a reason for the Geula, the question of Af is a little bit of a challenge. Again, I don't think it's such a big deal. Af and how you could see they were also instrumental, as opposed that they were also saved by the miracle. There are other ways of trying to deal with the Af phrase according to the Rashbam. So that's just a question of what that means. But then we turn to the issue about why specifically these three, which is particularly a question if it just means that they were redeemed, right? Why specifically Megilah, Hanukkah, and the Arba Kosot? And the Arba Kosot is particularly a challenge because we don't use the principle of Afin Hayu B'oto Hanes to explain that women should be obligated to eat matzah or to eat maror, right? That comes from some other drasha, from some other explanation. So why specifically these three? So the first thing that these three share is that they're all rabbinic. So that's one answer that sort of Tosa said, which is this principle of Afin Hayu B'oto Hanes to include women is basically a rabbinic principle. It's not biblical. So if you want to make women biblically obligated in matzah, you have to do it from another direction. This is rabbinic, and therefore this is the principle that's used to include them, in these rabbinic mitzvot. So that's one reason why it sort of focuses on those, and therefore maybe you could say things like sukkah, which is not rabbinic. We don't want to be using this principle. This principle we only want to use in sort of by rabbinic mitzvah. Rav Soloveitchik, however, gives an answer which is, I think, a much more satisfying one. And he says that the idea of nace is a very central idea in terms of the mitzvah of Megilah. We just used a phrase before to describe the central, the weight of the mitzvah of Megilah, which is what? Pirsume Nisa. What was the idea of Pirsume Nisa? Pirsume Nisa is you want to make sure that everybody participates, because by everybody's participation, it highlights the publicizing of the miracle. So the Kohanim leave the Beis HaMikdash, the Yeshiva Bachrim leave the Beis HaMedrash. Everybody comes because of Pirsume Nisa. So he says these mitzvot are the specific mitzvot. Let's first talk about the first two, right, which are the more obvious, Hanukkah and Purim. How do I know that Mikra Megillah and lighting Hanukkah candles have a specific identity as mitzvahs of Pirsum Hanes that other mitzvot don't have? Because those are the two mitzvot that you make the bracha of She'asa Nisim. You never make that bracha by any other mitzvah. And therefore, those two mitzvot, the whole one major part of their identity is you are lighting the Neirot Hanukkah so everybody sees it's done for the sake of Pirsum Hanes. So you're reading the Megilah to be mefarsem. Obviously, if you're alone, you light Hanukkah also, and you read Megilah also. But a central part of of the mitzvah is the fact that it is achieving Pirsumei Nisa. So if the goal is Pirsumei Nisa, you want as many people involved in the mitzvah as possible. And women, or another way, if women were part of the nace, and this whole thing is about the nace, and women do it as well. So it's both because it focuses on the nace and women were in the nace, and because it focuses on the nace, and therefore you want it to be mefarsein. So both the Nisa and the Pirsumei explains why you want to be including women. The Arba Kosot, similarly, is something that is done just for the sake of demonstrating, that you're b'nei chorim. Right, eating the matzah, eating the maror, those are not necessarily done. That's done. It's in the Torah. It might be to remember what happened, but like the act of eating matzah is not necessarily an act of demonstrating your b'nei chorim. The drinking of the wine and the arba kosod and the reclining, that is more the demonstrating of b'nei chorim, and that again is a pirsum hanes type of an act.
The Sukkah says a money do.
What is the nace of Purim? And the other two examples we have supernatural events.
Right.
What is the nace of Purim?
So it's a nace nistar. So that's the whole story of Purim, that God's name isn't there. But I'm saying that's the nace, right? That's the point. You can be mefarsem a nace nistar.
Yes. So the money do. So when we want women to sit there.
So that's a good point. But it's not as much to be mefarsem to others. It's more understood as you're sitting and you're remembering, as opposed to the sort of larger public. Okay. So last thing to say about women chayiv, which you can't not discuss, in this context, is the practical halacha. Not just this broad principle, but the practical halacha of women's obligation in Megilah. Are women equally obligated? Could they be motzi men? So let's take a look at Tosfos. Nashim chayavos b'mikra Megilah. This is obviously an important discussion that comes up around Purim time. Mikan mashma nashim motziot et ha'acherim yidei chovasan. That women are equally obligated and can read Megillah for others, for men, meaning midelo kamar lishmoa mikra Megillah. It doesn't say they're obligated to hear, which is a way of formulating a different level of obligation. No, they're obligated to read, so they can read for others. So everybody's obligated. It sounds like equal obligation, including women. Okay, and that is the way many Rishonim paskin. Women are equally obligated; they could read for men. But now Tosfos has a problem based on Hilchos Gedolos, and basically based on a Tosefta. The kasha, the habit Tosefta tani behedya, the tumtum ein motzi lot mino v'lot eino mino. A tumtum who you don't know if he's male or female can't be motzi another tumtum, because maybe tumtum number 1 is a female and tumtum number 2 is a male, and therefore a tumtum can't be motzi another tumtum because you don't know that somebody whose genitalia is covered up and you don't know if it's male or female. So that seems to be clear that women can't be motzi men, although it never says that, but that seems to be the problem of the tumtum. So then he says, "V'chein pasku." I'm skipping a little bit. "V'chein pasku hilchos gedolos." Disha motzia mina. A woman could be motzia woman of a low anashim, but not men. Okay, and then he says, so then maybe that's a way to read where all these Gemaras that say women are obligated, maybe means obligated, but at a different level. Obligated so that they can be motzi women, not obligated to be motzi men. And one way of framing it is that they're obligated to hear, but they're not obligated to read, so it's a different type of an obligation. So based on this Tosefta, the Hilchos Gedolos comes to a conclusion that women's obligation is different than men, and women can't be motzi men, but that's against the simple read of the Gemarot and many Rishonim. But a lot of Shonei Ashkenaz follow Tosfos following Hilchos Gedolot, and that leads to these issues about women reading the Megillah for men. Okay, so now let's get back to the Gemara. Okay, a lot of ground we're covering. Well, a lot of conceptual ground. I don't know, a lot of Gemara ground. Okay. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi also says, Purim shechal yop Shabbos sholim v'dorshim b'inyan sheyom. If Purim falls out on Shabbos, even though you're not going to read the Megillah, because you're not going to read the Megillah, you have an obligation, instead of reading the Megillah, to teach and talk about the issues relating to Purim. And Rashi specifically says it's not just Hilchos Purim, but Rashi says it's expounding on the Megillah itself. You have to give a shiur on the Megillah when Purim falls out on Shabbos, as in the substitute for actually reading the Megillah. So the Gemara says, Ma'ir Purim, what's the Chiddush Purim? Afili Yantiv Nami, even on Yantiv. Titania, we talked to the Breita. Moshe Tikilim Lishas, you show in Vidarshim Bin Yanosh Yom, that you have to, talk about the aspects of the Chag on the Chag. Hilchos Pesach, Hilchos Atzeres, Hilchos Chag b'Chag. So now it's not clear why just because you do it for a Yontiv, you should do it for Purim. So Toz says no. Here's the point: because for Yontiv, not only we say you're supposed to talk about it on Yontiv. What's the other halacha we say about Yontiv? Right? You're supposed to begin talking about the halacha Shloshim Yom Lifnei HaChag. So if by Yontiv, when you started talking about it for a month ago, you've been talking about it now, and you still are supposed to talk about it on the Yom itself. So certainly Purim, which you don't start talking about Hilchos Purim a month before Purim. Certainly Purim, all you have is the day itself. You certainly need to be talking about it on Purim itself. So what's the chiddush? Of course you have to talk about Purim on Purim itself. So the Gemara says no. Purim itzrichle. If you're still a chiddush by Purim. I might think you're not allowed to give a shiur on Megilah on Purim that's on Shabbos. Why? Because if you start darshaning the Megilah, then you'll come to take out your Megilah and you'll come to carry your Megilah. And maybe the same reason that Rabbi explains why you don't read the Megilah on Shabbos is because you might come to carry it. Maybe you shouldn't give a drush on the Megilah on Shabbos. Kaman Shmalan, that's not such a concern. That it's you have to read. So you have to take the. I don't know why it's not. There's logically the difference is not so clear, but it requires more of an expert to read. So you would bring your Megillah to an expert to read it. Whereas hearing a drasha, you just show up and you just listen. I'm not exactly sure because also one person giving the drush and one person reading the Megillah. But anyway, so we're not going to be worried about that. We're only going to be worried about reading the Megillah, not about giving a drasha of the Megillah. So that is an interesting idea, and by the way, it also does touch a little bit on the Pirsumei Nisa, because the basic point here is that reading of the Megillah, right, is the act of being mefarsing the nes. So then the question becomes, well, when you don't read the Megillah on the right day, so you say, okay, you do the Pirsumei Nisa on an earlier day, on a Monday, on a Thursday, on an Erev Shabbat, whenever you do it. But the idea of underscoring, not only are you not concerned that you'll come to carry on Shabbat, but you need to replace the reading of the Megillah with some type of a drasha about the Megillah, seems again, to some degree at least, be connected to this idea of Pirsumei Nes. Okay, Ve'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi also says, this is also a very important halacha. A lot of very important halachos Purim come from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Chayav adam likros Megillah b'layla v'lishnosa b'yom. A person has to read the Megillah at night and repeat it in the day. Shenemar Elohai ekra yomam. God, I will call out to you in the day. V'lo ta'aneh, but you don't answer. V'layla v'lo domi aliyah. And even at night, and I will not be silent. So that's it. So now how that's exactly relating to the Megillah? Okay, so first of all, that's a pasuk by Lamnatzeach al Ayelas HaShachar, which is understood to be a Mizmor of Tehillim that relates to Esther. But again, the idea of like calling out, in prayer, God save me, touches on the theme of Purim that like preceded the Nes Purim, right? And if you look at Rashi says, Ekra, about 10 lines before the lines get wide. B'mizmor lamnatzeach la'yelas shachahu shenemar al Esther kinamrinan, etc. Maseches Yoma. No. There was another Rashi I wanted to read you. V'lishnosa b'yom. The Rashi before that. Zecher l'neis shayazoakim b'yimei tzaratan yom v'layla. So an interesting way, using this pasuk that sort of frames the Megillah in terms of the crying out. You only really appreciate the nes if you appreciate the tzara that they were in. So the pasuk used to indicate the reading of the Megillah is a pasuk about calling out to God. So that's quite interesting. The focus on the nes really is appreciated by the focus on the tzara that preceded it. And from this pasuk we learn you have to do it at day and at night. Yes?
I've been waiting for something like this. When you said earlier that Psukim from Nach aren't used to prove things, Psukim from Nach are used to prove things all the time.
Not mitzvot in the Torah, right? So you're right. Meaning, I did say right. If you use a pasuk in Tanakh to prove something in the Torah, the Gemara will say, and before Yecheskel came, like Mi Amra, when like we had that recently, and it said, well, it must have been that it was a tradition, and Yecheskel came and he was put it on pasuk. So this is talking about like something I'd be curious just to hear about like what you're thinking about in terms of using a pasuk to prove for a doraisa purpose, because usually that's problematized. Here it's done for more like for a drabanan or for a smachta. But it is true. The point I was making before that we're darshaning psukim of the Megillah is not totally contrary, because we're darshaning psukim about a post-biblical mitzvah. So it doesn't really violate the principle that you don't use nach to teach you a deoraisa, but still the methodology is the same. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. Okay, so Savramina, when people heard this drasha that you have to read it at night, v'lishnosa bayom, and to repeat it in the day, well, the word lishnota has a very specific meaning in the sort of in the rabbinic, society, right? Mishnah v'lishnota. So Savramina, when people heard this drasha, right, they thought, "L'mikarya b'layla, we'll read it at night, and we'll learn the Mishnayos of Megilah in the day." V'lishnosa, to do Mishnayos of Megilah, to do a type of rabbinic learning in the day. So, Amalu Rabbi Yirmiyah, so Rabbi Yirmiyah said to them, no. No, it was explained to me that from Rabbi Chia bar was not what he meant. He meant, Kigon da Ami Inchi, ever parsha da, let me go over this parsha, v'asnaya, and let me repeat it. So v'lishnosa comes from the word sheni, to do it a second time, not from the word like lishanein, which means like mishnah, and gets you sort of the idea of a rabbinic teaching. I'll just read one more line and then I'll say something about this. Itmanami am Rabbi Chava amar ula bira, chayavodam likros Megilah b'layla v'lishnosa b'yom. You have to read it at night and repeat it in the day, and based on a different pasuk, a pasuk more about the miracle than about the crying out. Shenemar leman yizamercha kavod v'lo yidom, not be silent. Again, interesting, the word dome appears in both of those. Lo yidom, Hashem Elokai le'olam odeka. So the idea of all the time, laila and yom, is a way of framing like it's a constant sense of throughout the day, framing the day of praising God for the miracle. So by the way, that's interesting in the two aspects it expresses of this, like Pirsum Hanez. First, the tzara is part of that story, and then it's obviously the praise and the miracle. But I want to say two things about this. First of all, the idea that there was a havamina that you learned the Mishnayos in the day rather than reading it in the day gets back to a theme I've been mentioning, which is about the innovation of the Megilah, but through Chazal. Chazal were the one that decided that it was one of the Sifrei Tanakh. Chazal are the one that are seen in the first daf of Megilah. Anshe Knesses Hagadolah were the one that were metakein the Mikra Megilah, not that we're doing it because it's in the Megillah, but because Anshe Knesses Hagadolah were metakein it. We're learning all the halachot in a classic rabbinic way through a darshaning of the psukim. So I think it's interesting, like the havamina of, instead of reading the Megillah, already before, if it falls out on Shabbos, instead of reading it, you have a drasha of it. So here we thought, we read it last night from the day. Instead of reading it, we'll learn the Mishnayos. So this whole issue of of the rabbinic mode, and let's face it, the Megilah is coming at a time when you're sort of transitioning, right? It's right at the Beit Sheni period when you're transitioning from the period of Nivuah to the period of, if you would, rabbinic. It's a little early, in the rabbinic period, but it's Ezra HaSofer, right? So it's right at that sort of juxtaposition of the Nivuah and the type of Talmud Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh. So again, it's interesting here, the thought that could replace the Mikra Megillah is the learning of the Mishnayot. The other thing, though, that's very important to mention is the phrasing here makes it sound like the reading of night is more important. You have to read it at night and repeat it during the day. However, all of the evidence is the opposite. All of the Mishnayot that we're going to read coming up talk about the mitzvah of Megillah being a mitzvah of the day. And says, when does the mitzvah of Megillah start? From Alos HaShachar, or from Netzach Hama, etc. Mitzvah of Megillah is a day mitzvah. And basically the way some of the Achronim frame this is that reading the Megillah in the day is a mitzvah midivrei sofrim, because it's based on psukim, whereas reading the Megillah at night is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. Okay? That's a pure rabbinic, not based on the psukim. But the sort of primary pasuk-based, although pasuk through the interpretation of Chazal, as we've been saying, but primary pasuk-based mitzvah is in the day. The night is more halachically secondary and was added later, although the phrasing here sounds the opposite. Tosfos tries to reread the phrasing to get the day to be more important, and that's clear from all the evidence. It's very important because everybody thinks the night is more important because, it's better, it's an easier time to bring the whole family, and that's when the shul's do their whole big to-do is at night. But halachically speaking, if you had to choose between going to Megillah reading at night or Megillah reading in the day, you go to Megillah reading in the day. And a lot of people aren't makpid enough to go the next day. They went the previous night, but the next day is the primary mitzvah of Megillah, the phrasing of this notwithstanding. Okay, let's turn the page. I'm Rabbi Chanina, so the villages start Monday and Thursday. The sages were easy for the villages to let them do the reading on the market days. order that they should provide water and food to their brethren in the large cities. Okay, now, first of all, I just want to say one thing, number one, about Monday and Thursday. The first Rashi, I wasn't here when you did the first daf. The first Rashi says it's because it's the day where the Batei Dinim are Kivuim, and therefore everybody's coming into the, to the main town in order to go to a Beis Din. Now, how many people need to go to a Beis Din? So Rabbeinu Hananel said it's not because the Batei Dinim are there. He says that's the idea. The phrase of Rabbeinu Hananel on Beis Amud Aleph was. Let me just read it here. It says like this. מפני שנכנסים בני הכפרים בכרכים כדי שיתפלל בציבור ויקראו בספר תורה. So it's quite interesting. He says because it was a day that you read the Sefer Torah, people wanted to at least come to shul. Even if you don't come to shul on a daily basis, they wanted to come to shul at least on a day when they had Kriyas HaTorah. So according to him, that's why they're coming in, and that's why those days became sort of market days or days to people to gather. So that's just coming in. But now the reason is, in order to provide bread and food for their brethren in the larger cities, makes it sound like we're going to try to get it for you. This is for you to come early, not to read the Megilah on a day we're reading. You guys, like it's like the catering, like the people that work in the kitchen, you have your meal beforehand, and then you'll serve everybody else. You guys take care of your reading of the meal beforehand, so on Purim itself, you'll be available to have your stores open for the people of the big cities, which really puts them in a very second-class type of status. The Gemara is going to reframe this. So let's just read one line and turn the page. When Memra says the Gemara, this suggests to Takanta de Krochimavi, we're doing all of this to make things better for the big cities. V'atanan, didn't we teach in a mission? Notice, by the way, here, Krach is used to mean a city of the 14th, not a walled city of the 15th. So that's a little confusing. Gets back to the point we made before about the Asar Batlanim. Does Krach mean walled city, or does it mean a large, unwalled city? Anyway, that we're doing all of this for the large cities. V'atanan, Chalios B'Sheni, if it's on a Monday, everybody reads on the same day. If you're going to make these people read early to be available, then they should always read early, even when it falls out on a Monday. If you're doing this to make it easier for the big cities, even when it's on a Monday, make these guys read on a Thursday. No. Then you'll be back to the 10th of Adar. When we learned only X number of days, you can't go back to the 10th. Okay, let's try again. Tashma Chalios B'Chamishi. If it's on a Thursday, everybody reads on a Thursday. And if you're trying to dafka make these guys go early, let them read instead of on Thursday on a Monday. It's the 11th of Adar. So the Gemara says no. It's we have to have, we keep it on a market day. We're not going to push it off to a different one, which doesn't really answer the question. Okay, Tashma. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Aim aside. I'm getting to the two dots. Aim aside. When is it that we go early? In places where the villages come in on a Monday and a Thursday. If the villages don't usually come in on a Monday and Thursday, then you don't have them read early. But if the whole thing is for the betterment of the large cities, what do I care if they don't normally come in? Let them come in, let them read it, so they'll be available to take care of the large cities. Like, what is it like they said, because you had a bad day, why should I suffer, right? So, that line from Fiddle on the Roof, just because you don't come in, so what? Come in, so you'll be available for the big cities. If that's really what's going on here. So the Gemara says, okay, let's reverse it. It's not we do it so that they will provide for the larger cities. We don't do it for the sake of the larger cities. Ella Ema, read it the opposite way. Because they generally, and this is the way Rabbi Hananel reads it, since in general you come in the market days and you're there to provide, you do all these things that are for the betterment of the larger cities, therefore we're going to be nice to you and make it easy for you. So we're going back to the sake that this is to make it easier for the villages. It's not to make it more convenient for the large cities. And Rabbeinu Hananel says, anyway, what's happening is they're not providing food on Purim. They're coming in on the market day so that everybody can buy their provisions for Purim. Because the way Rabbeinu Hananel says it is, he said, if you didn't do this, what would happen? They would say, I'm not coming in on Thursday. I have to come in anyway tomorrow because tomorrow is Purim, and therefore the markets won't be open on Thursday. So if you want to have the markets open on the Monday and Thursdays, you make it convenient for them to read on that day as well. But ultimately, because of the general service that they provide, that's why we're going to this for their sake, not for the sake of the larger cities. Okay, we went a little over, but at least we got to the 2 dots.